I got paired with my best friend for couples roleplay in class. Everyone thought we were real. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a new upload. Every subscription helps us bring more touching, emotional, and unforgettable stories to life. Thank you for supporting our channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. The fastest way to convince yourself you're not in love with your best friend is to pretend you're dating him in front of an entire college campus. If someone had told me that sentence would describe my junior year at Westbridge University, I would have laughed, grabbed my backpack, and walked the other direction. Instead, I was sitting in Professor Adler's communication dynamics class on a rainy Tuesday morning, spinning a pen between my fingers while wondering if I had enough coffee left to survive a 90-minute lecture. Caleb Whitmore sat beside me like he had for almost every class since freshman orientation, quietly highlighting notes with the same impossible level of concentration that somehow made everyone else look unprepared. We had been best friends for nearly 3 years. We studied together, argued over basketball, split late-night pizza deliveries, and knew each other's coffee orders by heart. People joke that we spent more time together than married couples. We always laughed it off because that was easier than explaining how comfortable friendship could become after enough shared memories. Professor Adler clapped once, instantly stealing everyone's attention. For your final project, he announced with the kind of smile that usually meant trouble, you'll participate in a long-term couples role-play designed to study communication, trust, and conflict resolution. Half the classroom groaned. Someone in the back actually whispered, "No way." The professor ignored every complaint. You'll remain in character for 3 weeks during designated campus activities. Meals, interviews, presentations, and selected social events will all count toward your evaluation. My stomach tightened. Caleb looked over and raised one eyebrow, the silent expression we both used whenever something ridiculous happened. This was definitely one of those moments. Then came the part nobody expected. Instead of letting us choose partners, Professor Adler pulled out a box filled with folded index cards. Random assignment, he said cheerfully. Real growth begins outside your comfort zone. Students shuffled forward one by one, reading names with relieved smiles or dramatic sighs. I wasn't paying much attention until Caleb unfolded his card. His expression froze for exactly 1 second before he slowly turned it toward me. My own name stared back from the paper in thick black marker. I blinked. Seriously? Caleb laughed under his breath. Looks like we're partners. Before I could answer, I unfolded my own card. His name. The room exploded before either of us said another word. No way, someone shouted. They're already basically dating. Another voice chimed in. This is going to be the easiest A in history. Laughter rolled across the classroom. My face felt warmer than it should have. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, smiling with that calm, effortless grin that somehow made every awkward situation seem manageable. Guess we'll survive, he said quietly. I forced a laugh. Yeah, it's only 3 weeks. Professor Adler waited for the room to settle before delivering one final instruction. Starting the moment class ends, he said, folding his hands behind his back. Everyone will treat this project as reality. If strangers believe your relationship is genuine, don't correct them. Authentic reactions are part of the experiment. Silence settled over the classroom for the first time all morning. I looked at Caleb. He looked back at me. Somewhere deep inside, beneath every joke, every shared meal, and every year of pretending certain thoughts didn't exist, a single dangerous realization quietly surfaced. I wasn't worried about pretending to be his boyfriend. I was terrified of how natural it might feel. The project officially began the second we stepped outside the classroom, and apparently the entire campus had received the memo before we had even reached the hallway. A group of students from the journalism club walked past us, one of them flashing an exaggerated thumbs up. Another whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. They finally admitted it. Caleb glanced at me with an amused smile. Should we correct them? I remembered Professor Adler's instructions and shook my head. Guess not. He shrugged so casually that it almost annoyed me. How could he act like pretending to be someone else's boyfriend for 3 weeks was no more stressful than deciding where to eat lunch? By Wednesday morning, our schedule had already become strangely synchronized. We met outside the student union before our first class because the assignment required us to document daily interactions. We ordered breakfast together, compared notes for our afternoon lectures, and answered interview questions from graduate assistants who followed each pair around campus with clipboards. Every conversation was supposed to reveal communication habits, conflict styles, and emotional awareness. Instead, most of the interviews turned into people commenting on how naturally Caleb and I interacted. "You two finish each other's sentences," one assistant observed while checking a box on her evaluation sheet. Caleb laughed. "We have known each other forever." I nodded, trying not to notice that he instinctively reached over to brush a tiny crumb off the sleeve of my hoodie before returning his hand to his coffee cup, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The cameras caught everything. So did I. By the end of the week, our photos began appearing on the university's social media page. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary moments. Caleb holding the library door open for me laughing while he unsuccessfully tried to convince me that pineapple belonged on pizza. Both of us walking across the quad carrying far too many textbooks because neither of us wanted the other struggling with the extra weight. The comments underneath were impossible to ignore. "They are adorable." I knew they were dating. Relationship goals. I should have found the whole thing ridiculous. Instead, every notification made my pulse jump a little faster. Friday afternoon brought the first official role-play activity outside the classroom. Each pair was assigned to prepare a short presentation about healthy communication while sitting together in one of the busiest areas of campus. Halfway through our discussion, Caleb leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. "You are overthinking this again." "I am not. You have been staring at the same paragraph for 5 minutes." I sighed. "Maybe I am." He smiled with quiet satisfaction. "There he is. Honest Landon." Before I could answer, a passing student stopped in front of our table. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, holding up her phone. "Would you guys mind taking a picture together? My roommate refuses to believe couples like you actually exist." I nearly choked on my iced tea. Caleb simply stood beside me without hesitation. As the camera lifted, he rested a light hand against my shoulder and smiled naturally. The photo took less than 3 seconds. The strange feeling it left behind stayed with me all evening. Walking back toward our apartments beneath the orange glow of campus lights, neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "pretending is getting easier." I forced a grin, even though my heart suddenly felt much heavier. "Yeah," I answered. "That is exactly what scares me." By the beginning of the second week, the roleplay had escaped the boundaries of Professor Adler's assignment and taken on a life of its own. It started with a photograph from the student union, then another from the library, and then a short video someone posted of Caleb laughing after I accidentally spilled popcorn all over our table during movie night for the communication project. None of the posts were embarrassing. If anything, they looked surprisingly ordinary. That was probably why people believed them. Nothing about us seemed staged anymore. The comments multiplied faster than either of us could keep track of them. Students we had never met smiled when we walked across campus. The barista at our favorite coffee shop automatically put both drinks on the same order without asking. Someone even left a handwritten note on our study table that simply read, "You two restored my faith in relationships." I folded the paper into my notebook without saying a word. Caleb noticed, but did not tease me. That alone felt unusual. Tuesday afternoon brought another unexpected surprise. The university marketing office contacted Professor Adler, looking for volunteers to appear in a promotional campaign about campus life. Apparently, several students had recommended Caleb and me because we looked approachable, comfortable, and authentic together. Authentic. That word echoed inside my head much longer than it should have. We agreed to participate because saying no would only invite questions. The photo session took place near the old brick fountain in the center of campus. The photographer barely gave us any directions. "Just talk like you normally do," she said. "Pretend I am not here." Caleb looked at me and smiled. "That might actually be the easiest assignment we have had all semester." I rolled my eyes. "Only because you never stop talking." He laughed immediately. "That is objectively false. You literally narrated making scrambled eggs yesterday. You looked confused." I was half asleep. "Exactly." The photographer lowered her camera and grinned. "Perfect. Do not change a thing." We had forgotten she was even standing there. That realization stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. On our walk back to class, I caught myself matching Caleb's pace without thinking. When he slowed down to avoid a group of freshmen crossing the sidewalk, I slowed too. When I reached for the door of the science building, he instinctively reached for it at the same time, and both of us laughed after bumping hands against the handle. Tiny moments. Meaningless moments. Except they no longer felt meaningless. Later that evening, we met in the library to prepare for another interview with the graduate assistants. One of the questions caught me completely off guard. What is one habit your partner has that makes you feel appreciated? The interviewer asked. I opened my mouth, expecting to invent an answer for the sake of the assignment. But the truth arrived before anything fictional could. He always notices when I am overwhelmed, I admitted quietly. Even before I do. The room fell. Strangely silent. Caleb looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. When it was his turn, he answered without hesitation. Landon reminds me to enjoy things instead of trying to make everything perfect. Neither response had been planned. Neither response sounded like acting. As we packed our bags afterward, I realized something unsettling. The project had asked us to build believable chemistry. Instead, it had simply forced us to pay attention to feelings that had been quietly growing in places neither of us had been brave enough to look before. Wednesday mornings usually smelled like fresh coffee, wet grass, and unfinished homework. They were predictable, comfortable, safe. That illusion disappeared the moment I walked into the psychology building and saw Caleb standing in the hallway, talking to someone I had never met before. She was tall, confident, and effortlessly polished, with a stack of research folders tucked beneath one arm. Every few seconds, Caleb laughed at something she said, the kind of genuine laugh that reached his eyes. I slowed my steps without realizing it. My brain immediately searched for a perfectly reasonable explanation. Study group, class project, academic club, anything except the strange feeling growing in the middle of my chest. Before I could talk myself out of it, Caleb noticed me. His face brightened instantly. Landon, there you are. He waved me over. This is Victoria Hale. She is a senior working on an honors research project. Victoria smiled warmly and offered her hand. I have heard a lot about you. Hopefully nothing embarrassing, I answered with a nervous laugh. She shook her head. Actually, Caleb talks about you all the time. My heart skipped once, then immediately reminded me that best friends talked about each other. That was normal. Completely normal. Victoria explained that she wanted Caleb to assist with a behavioral research study because of his outstanding grades in psychology. It sounded like an incredible opportunity, the kind professors remembered when writing recommendation letters. I congratulated him sincerely. I meant every word. At least I wanted to believe I did. The rest of the day became strangely unbalanced. Caleb disappeared into meetings with Victoria between classes while I finished assignments alone at the library. Every empty chair across from me felt unusually noticeable. I caught myself glancing toward the entrance every few minutes before reminding myself how ridiculous I was being. We had spent years doing things separately whenever our schedules demanded it. Nothing had changed, except somehow everything had. That evening, the communication project required each pair to record reflections about balancing outside responsibilities with relationships. We met in one of the media rooms after dinner. Caleb arrived 10 minutes late, slightly out of breath, apologizing before he even sat down. Victoria lost track of time reviewing data, he explained. I should have texted you sooner. It is fine, I replied too quickly. You do not have to explain. He studied my face for a second longer than usual. Are you sure? Absolutely. The lies sounded convincing enough to fool almost anyone. Unfortunately, Caleb had known me for 3 years. He frowned slightly, but let the conversation move on. During the recording, one of the graduate assistants asked a simple question. How do you respond when your partner becomes busy with other commitments? Caleb answered first. You support them because you want them to succeed. Then the assistant looked at me. I smiled for the camera, but the words caught somewhere between my heart and my voice. I guess. I paused, searching for honesty that would not reveal too much. I guess you learn whether you miss the routine or the person. Silence settled over the room. Even the assistant stopped writing for a moment. Caleb looked at me with quiet surprise, almost as though he had heard something hidden beneath the sentence. Walking home beneath the cool evening sky, neither of us spoke very much. The campus lights reflected across rain puddles left by an afternoon shower, turning the sidewalks into ribbons of gold. I finally understood why the last 2 days had felt so different. It was not jealousy of Victoria. It was fear. Fear that someday this assignment would end, our carefully borrowed routine would disappear, and someone else might naturally step into the place beside Caleb that I had slowly begun to think of as mine. The campus retreat arrived sooner than anyone expected, and for the first time since the project began, every pair in Professor Adler's class would spend an entire weekend away from the distractions of lectures, deadlines, and crowded hallways. The university owned a small conference lodge about 40 miles outside the city, surrounded by hiking trails, quiet lakes, and towering pine trees that seemed untouched by the constant rush of college life. The moment our shuttle pulled into the parking lot, everyone climbed out stretching after the hour-long ride, while staff members handed out room assignments. I barely glanced at the paper before hearing someone laugh nearby. "Looks like nothing changes," one classmate joked. "Landon and Caleb are roommates again." I looked down at my assignment card and smiled despite myself. Of course we were. The communication project had paired us together from the beginning, and apparently the retreat followed the same logic. Our room was simple but comfortable, with two twin beds separated by a small nightstand facing a large window overlooking the lake. Caleb tossed his backpack onto one bed before opening the curtains. "I could get used to this view," he admitted. The late afternoon sunlight reflected across the water in shimmering waves while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the open window. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. The quiet felt different from campus. There were no classmates passing by, no cameras documenting our interactions, and no strangers assuming they knew our story. After dinner, the professors encouraged everyone to explore the property before the evening reflection session. Caleb and I wandered along the lakeside trail, listening to the steady rhythm of crickets and the occasional splash of fish breaking the calm surface of the water. Without assignments or interviews interrupting us, our conversation slowly drifted away from the project. We talked about childhood memories, embarrassing high school stories, favorite road trips with our families, and the strange realization that graduation was only a year away. "Does that scare you?" I asked quietly. Caleb looked across the lake before answering. "Not graduation. What comes after?" I nodded because I understood exactly what he meant. Everything familiar eventually changed. Friends moved away. Careers began. Daily routines disappeared. The thought settled heavier than I wanted to admit. Later that night, after the group activities ended, we returned to our room carrying cups of hot chocolate from the lodge kitchen. Rain tapped gently against the windows as thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the hills. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed while I leaned against the headboard across the room. Somehow the conversation continued as though neither of us wanted the day to end. He told me about the pressure he felt to always make the right decision because everyone expected him to have life figured out. I admitted that I often hid behind humor whenever I was afraid of disappointing people. One honest confession led naturally to another until the hours slipped by unnoticed. The digital clock beside the beds quietly changed from 11:30 to 12:45. At one point, Caleb yawned in the middle of a sentence and laughed at himself. "I was trying to stay awake," he murmured. "You almost made it," I replied with a smile. A few seconds later, he shifted closer without thinking, resting comfortably beside me as exhaustion finally caught up with him. His breathing slowed until the room became completely still except for the soft rain outside. I looked toward the dark window, then back at my best friend sleeping peacefully only a few feet away. The words I had been carrying for weeks rose to the surface, stopping just behind my lips. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to admit that somewhere between pretending and reality, my heart had quietly crossed a line it could never uncross. Instead, I simply whispered the truth into the silence where only I could hear it, knowing the night would keep my secret for a little while longer. When we returned to campus on Monday morning, everything looked exactly the same, yet something between Caleb and me had quietly shifted. We still walked to class together. We still shared breakfast before our morning lectures. We still laughed over the smallest things as though nothing had changed. But after the retreat, every ordinary moment carried a new weight because I could no longer convince myself that my feelings belonged only to the assignment. The final week of Professor Adler's project had officially begun, and everyone seemed eager to see how the experiment would conclude. Graduate assistants collected journals, reviewed recorded interviews, and reminded us that our last evaluation would take place on Friday. Rumors spread across campus that the professor had spent hours watching every conversation, every presentation, and every interaction we had documented over the past 3 weeks. During our final class meeting, the atmosphere felt surprisingly emotional. Even students who had complained about the project on the first day admitted they had learned something unexpected about themselves. Professor Adler stood quietly at the front of the room until every conversation faded away. Then he smiled. Most of you believe this course was about convincing other people that your assigned relationships looked believable, he began. It was never about acting. The room became completely silent. He continued, the purpose of this project was to observe whether trust could develop through consistent honesty, shared experiences, and genuine attention. Communication is never measured by performance alone. It is measured by whether people gradually stop performing. Several students exchanged confused glances. Then the professor displayed a series of anonymous observations gathered throughout the semester. Couples who constantly exaggerated affection had scored surprisingly low because their conversations lacked authenticity. Others who struggled at first had gradually become comfortable simply being themselves. Finally, Professor Adler looked directly toward Caleb and me. One pair stood out from the beginning, he said calmly. Not because they appeared perfect, but because somewhere during the project they stopped treating the assignment like an assignment. My heartbeat became painfully loud. He held up one of the evaluation folders. Without realizing it, they forgot when the cameras were recording. They encouraged each other naturally. They solved disagreements honestly. They noticed each other's stress before either person admitted it. They built trust instead of performing romance. Soft laughter spread across the classroom as several classmates immediately turned toward us. Someone whispered, "We knew it." Another quietly applauded. My face grew warm while Caleb stared at the desk in front of him with an expression I had never seen before. It was not embarrassment. It looked more like quiet realization. Professor Adler closed the folder and offered one final thought. Whether any relationship lasts beyond this classroom is entirely your own decision. My responsibility was simply to create an environment where honesty had room to appear. Class ended a few minutes later, but neither Caleb nor I stood up immediately. The room slowly emptied until only a handful of students remained collecting backpacks and notebooks. Finally, Caleb looked at me with a small, uncertain smile. I guess we forgot to keep pretending. I laughed softly, although my chest felt impossibly tight. Maybe we did. We walked out of the classroom together without speaking very much. The hallway that had once been filled with jokes about our fake relationship now felt strangely different. Every step carried us closer to the moment when the project would officially end, and for the first time since all of this had begun, I realized the assignment was no longer the thing I was afraid of losing. I was afraid of losing whatever had quietly become real between us before either of us had found the courage to give it a name. The official project ended on Friday at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was surprising how something that had filled every corner of my daily routine for 3 weeks could simply end with a professor thanking everyone for participating and reminding us to enjoy the rest of the semester. Students gathered their notebooks, exchanged hugs with their assigned partners, and laughed about awkward moments that already felt like distant memories. Caleb and I walked out of the classroom together, just as we had done dozens of times before. The difference was that neither of us seemed to know what came next. We crossed the main quad in comfortable silence until we reached the old oak tree where students often stopped between classes. Caleb slipped both hands into the pockets of his jacket and smiled, although it looked smaller than usual. "Well," he said, letting out a slow breath, "starting tomorrow we do not have to pretend anymore." His words were gentle, matter of fact, probably even meant to make things easier. Somehow they landed like a door quietly closing. I forced myself to smile back. "Right," I answered. "The project is over." Caleb nodded once. "It is strange, though. I am probably going to miss it." I wanted to ask what exactly he meant. The interviews, the routine, or me. Instead, I simply wished him a good evening before turning toward my apartment. He called my name once as I walked away, but I lifted one hand without looking back, pretending I had not noticed the hesitation in his voice. The next few days became painfully unfamiliar. For the first time in years, I started leaving my apartment earlier than necessary just to avoid running into Caleb before class. I chose different tables in the student union, studied in another section of the library, and even took a longer route across campus that added nearly 10 minutes to my walk. Every decision felt childish, yet I could not stop myself. If he no longer wanted us to keep acting like we belonged together, then maybe the easiest way to protect myself was to remember that none of it had ever been real. At least that was the story I kept repeating. My friends quickly noticed something had changed. One afternoon, a classmate sat across from me in the cafeteria and frowned. "Where is Caleb today?" I shrugged without looking up from my sandwich. "Busy, I guess." The answer sounded hollow even to me. Meanwhile, Caleb seemed just as confused. I caught him searching the lecture hall before class started, his eyes scanning the rows until they briefly found mine. Each time I looked away first, he sent a few text messages asking if everything was all right. I replied with short answers that sounded polite but distant. Nothing was technically wrong. That was the problem. There was no argument to solve, no misunderstanding anyone else could see. Only one sentence continued echoing inside my mind. "Starting tomorrow, we do not have to pretend anymore." By Thursday evening, the distance between us felt larger than the entire campus. Walking home beneath a sky streaked with pink and gold, I realized I missed the smallest things the most. The extra coffee Caleb always brought when he knew I had an early class. The conversations that wandered from serious to ridiculous without warning. The effortless certainty that wherever I was heading, he would probably be walking beside me. I had convinced myself I was protecting my heart by stepping away. Instead, every step only proved how deeply it had already been involved. While somewhere else on campus, Caleb was still trying to understand why his best friend had suddenly disappeared from his everyday life. Saturday evening arrived with the annual spring festival, transforming the center of campus into a sea of music, food trucks, colorful lights, and students celebrating the final stretch of the semester. Normally, it was one of my favorite traditions. This year I almost stayed home. My roommate finally convinced me to go, insisting that hiding in my apartment would not magically solve anything. I wandered through the crowded walkways carrying a paper cup of fresh lemonade, pretending to pay attention to the live band while my thoughts kept drifting somewhere else. Every familiar place reminded me of Caleb. The fountain where we had posed for photographs. The student union where we had shared breakfast before class. Even the library windows reflected memories I could not seem to leave behind. I had almost decided to leave when I heard someone call my name from across the festival grounds. I turned instinctively. Caleb stood near the entrance to the main stage, weaving through the crowd toward me before I had time to react. He looked relieved just to find me. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I hesitated for only a second before nodding. We walked together until the music faded into the background, stopping beneath a row of glowing string lights stretched between two old maple trees. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "I have been trying to understand what happened." I looked down at the grass. Nothing happened. He smiled sadly. "Landon, you have never been able to lie to me." I laughed once under my breath because he was right. He always knew. "When you said we did not have to pretend anymore," I admitted slowly, "I thought you meant you were ready to leave everything behind." I figured the project ended, and so did whatever this was. Caleb stared at me in complete surprise. "That is what you heard?" I nodded. "What did you mean?" Before he could answer, an energetic student volunteer rushed over holding a microphone. "Perfect," she said excitedly. "Everyone still thinks you two are together. We need one more couple for the festival game on stage. Please help us out." I immediately shook my head. "We are not." The words stopped before they reached the end of the sentence. Caleb gently touched my arm. "Come with me," he said. I searched his face, saw quiet determination instead of uncertainty, and followed him onto the brightly lit stage. The host welcomed us with a huge smile while hundreds of students gathered below. "Looks like one of our favorite campus couples made it," he joked, earning cheerful applause from the crowd. I wanted to explain everything, but Caleb reached for the microphone before I could speak. The noise around us gradually faded as he took one slow breath. "There is something I need to say," he began. The entire audience became silent. Caleb turned toward me instead of the crowd. 3 weeks ago, I agreed to pretend because I thought it would be easy. Somewhere along the way, I stopped pretending. My heartbeat became impossibly loud. He smiled with the same warmth that had carried me through countless ordinary days. "When I said we did not have to pretend anymore, I was hoping we could finally be honest instead. The only thing I have ever been pretending was that you were only my best friend. I care about you far more than this project ever asked me to, and I have for longer than I knew how to admit. For a second the world seemed completely still. Then I smiled through eyes that refused to stay dry, stepped closer, and answered with the simplest truth I had been carrying all semester. I have been waiting to hear those words longer than you know. 1 year later, it became almost impossible to walk across Westbridge University without someone remembering how our story had started. New students knew only the simplified version. They had heard that two best friends had been assigned to a communication project, spent 3 weeks pretending to be a couple, and somehow graduated with something neither of them had expected. The people who had actually witnessed it knew the truth was quieter than the rumors. There had been no dramatic plan, no perfect script, and no magical moment that changed everything overnight. There had simply been thousands of ordinary conversations, shared mornings, honest laughter, difficult misunderstandings, and the courage to finally stop hiding behind the word pretending. Caleb and I settled into our relationship with the same comfortable rhythm that had defined our friendship from the very beginning. Saturday mornings still meant coffee from the student union before either of us was fully awake. We still debated whether pineapple belonged on pizza, and neither of us had changed our opinion. We still spent long evenings studying in the library, except now nobody questioned why we always chose the same table by the window. The only real difference was that neither of us had to wonder what the other was feeling anymore. Graduation approached faster than either of us expected. Between internship applications, final presentations, and planning for life after college, our schedules became busier than ever, yet somehow we learned that love was rarely about grand gestures. It was about remembering an early morning exam and bringing an extra cup of coffee. It was about waiting outside a classroom after a difficult presentation without being asked. It was about celebrating small victories that most people never noticed. During our final week on campus, Professor Adler invited our class back for one last discussion. The desks had been rearranged into a large circle, just like the first day we met, but the room felt completely different. We were no longer strangers completing an assignment. We had become people who understood that communication was built through consistency rather than performance. Near the end of the conversation, one student asked Professor Adler whether he had expected any real relationships to come from the project. He smiled thoughtfully before answering. I never designed the assignment to create romance. I designed it to remove distractions so people could truly see each other. Everything that happened after that belonged entirely to them. His eyes briefly met ours, and Caleb reached over beneath the desk to quietly lace his fingers with mine. It felt natural, effortless, and wonderfully ordinary. After class ended, we walked together toward the humanities building where everything had begun more than a year earlier. The bulletin board outside the classroom had already been updated with next semester's courses, but one familiar line remained beneath the new announcements. Couples Roleplay Project. I stopped for a moment and smiled at the faded words. Caleb noticed and laughed softly. Hard to believe that one class changed everything. I looked at him before answering. The class did not change everything. It just gave us an excuse to stop running from what was already there. He smiled in the quiet way I had loved long before I admitted it to myself. As we continued across campus beneath the warm afternoon sun, students hurried past us toward lectures, club meetings, and futures they could not yet imagine. A year earlier, I believed the greatest challenge would be pretending to love my best friend. Looking back, I realized the difficult part had never been pretending. The difficult part had been finding the courage to admit that the happiest chapter of my life had started long before either of us found the words to call it real.